Okay, so in this video, I want to do a kind of overview of the Black Death, go through the context for this, and look at one of the assigned readings. And then I'll do a second video on the Black Death where we go through some of the other readings. I'm not going to cover absolutely every source that I assigned in the Horrocks book for this. You can, do some of the work on that, but I'll try to point out the kind of the most important themes, issues, and such that we see in the primary source material. The Black Death did not happen randomly. It did not occur in a vacuum, as historians are wont to say. There was important context to this that made it possible, we might say. That made it so the spread of this plague was much worse than it would have otherwise been. And a lot of that has to do with the increasing globalization of the world in the High and Late Middle Ages. The trade routes that linked different parts of the world had been around since ancient times, but they saw a significant growth and a significant uptick in the volume of trade in the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries. A lot of that came, connected, I should say, goods in Europe, goods that were in demand in Europe, with things that were being produced in places like China, India, and the Middle East, and even parts of Africa, okay? And a lot of these goods that were at least coming from China and India were distributed or were traded along this thing that is colloquially called the Silk Road, right? It passed through Central Asia here, through major trading cities like Samarkand and Bukhara and Khiva, and then over here to places like Baghdad and Damascus and Beirut, and ultimately to Constantinople, to Cairo, and from these places then to the west, particularly the cities of Italy were involved in trade, and had trade outposts in places like Constantinople, in areas along the Black Sea, and in Cairo and Alexandria and places like that in Egypt. And so these trade routes were the way that the Black Death spread. With the goods that were being traded along these major roads, the plague traveled as well, right, and affected all of the regions there. We've talked already in a previous lecture about the possible relationship between the Great Famine and the Black Death, that those who were children during the time of the Great Famine may have been compromised kind of physiologically, and immunologically, we might say, that they were maybe not more susceptible to disease, but because their bodies were weakened by having been subjected to conditions of starvation when they were children, that they were not able to survive the plague as much as they might have done. This is a possible explanation for why the mortality rates are so high in the 1347 to 1351 initial epidemic. And it's important to note that bubonic plague was something that occurred every few years in Europe for the next 3 or 4 centuries, all the way up to around the end, I should say, of the 17th century. There were continued outbreaks of plague, and they occur even after that, maybe less frequently, right? So this is a disease, much like, influenza or now COVID, that we can expect to see crop up over and over again, but the initial mortality was much worse than later. This also hits Europe when it is in a period of crisis due to a number of things, some of which we've talked about briefly already, and some of which I'll mention here also briefly. For one, the upheaval caused by the expansion of the Mongols in the 13th century. So the Mongols were, of course, from this region up here, Mongolia, okay? They had attacked China and taken over China and established the Yuan dynasty there. They had made it down into Central Asia and up into what is now Russia, and had sort of carved, and then eventually into the Middle East, right? They had carved up all of this territory and established these kingdoms, which they called khanates, all of which were beholden, at least theoretically, to the great Khan who lived in China, the emperor of the Yuan dynasty, but really functioned independently. Now, the Mongols did not make it into Western Europe, but they did hit Eastern Europe, and they raided continually. And descendants of the Mongols, were threatening the Byzantine Empire and the various political entities that existed in the Middle East, right? The Turks who were governing there, including the early Ottomans. And so that the Mongols were there, that they were a threat, right, is a factor here and caused some amount of chaos. We've already talked about how the papacy during this period was in crisis, that the popes were no longer living in the city of Rome. They were instead in the city of Avignon, which is roughly right here in southern France. This was papal territory, but they were driven there, as it were, or kind of forced there by the French king, who had a great deal of influence in the papal court. And so the Avignon papacy was taken as a sign of the degeneration of the church, and there was a great deal of criticism leveled at the church generally and at the papacy specifically in this period. And this is one of the explanations, of course, that the authors provide for why these calamities keep happening. We already read in the Middle English poem, the Simony, the criticism of the Pope and the other clergy, that they're kind of blaming them for the Great Famine. Well, the same sort of thing happens in the Black Death. The 100 Years' War and other wars were raging at this point. The Battle of Crécy, which was one of the definitive battles in the early part of the war, in the Edwardian phase, the Edward III phase of the war, that had happened in 1346, only a couple of years before the plague struck that same region. And so this was causing a lot of chaos and upheaval too. And because of the Great Famine, because of a number of factors, because Europe had, by some accounts at least, kind of maxed out its potential for growing food, all of the possible land that could have been brought into cultivation had been brought into cultivation, or they were close to it, that they were seeing a contraction of the agricultural economy. Lots of factors, and it's a complicated thing. But this certainly didn't help things. And then the plague only served to contract that even further, of course. The pathology of the plague, this is caused by a strain of bacteria, which is called scientifically Yersinia pestis. And it's a single bacterium, but it does manifest in different ways in the body depending on, the person. There are different symptoms. The most common symptom that's described by the medieval sources are these swellings in the lymph nodes. This is where Yersinia pestis infects lymph nodes and causes swellings in like the armpit, the groin, the neck, other places where you find lymph nodes, right? If you've gotten a cold or the flu or something like that and had your glands swell up, right? It's the same thing except much, much worse. You can see a modern picture, I think this is from the 1970s in Southeast Asia, what these buboes actually look like on a person here. But then, there are lots of medieval depictions of these where the buboes seem to be covering the whole body. And over here is the physician looking up at the stars and trying to figure out what's going on. So that's the most common. The mortality rates for the bubonic form of the plague are lower than the cases of the disease where it manifests other symptoms, but it's still a very high mortality rate, right? If the disease gets in the lungs and infects the lungs, it can become an airborne disease. People can cough and sneeze and get a runny nose and all of that and spread this through airborne bodily fluids. It is the same disease. It's not a different disease, but the pneumonic form of this, right? And then if it infects the blood, this is what's known as the septicemic form of the plague, then this is particularly deadly. And this is probably why it's called the Black Death, because if the disease infects the blood, it tends to cause the blood to clot and coagulate in the vessels, and when the clotted blood reaches the capillaries in places like the fingers and the toes and the extremities of the body, then it causes them to burst, and you get severe bruising, and the skin of the hands and feet turns blue and then black. That's probably where Black Death comes from, is an observation of this symptom. the septicemic plague seems to have an almost 100% mortality rate, right? There is, of course, some debate over numbers of people who died. What is certain is that this, and there's a map on the next page, let me go to this. You can see the basic spread of the plague, right? So it comes via the Silk Road and other major trade routes to places like Constantinople. There were Italian merchants resident in Constantinople. There were whole neighborhoods in Constantinople where Italian merchants from places like Genoa and Venice lived. And so then they brought this to these Italian cities. It hit the cities of the coast in 1347. It spread into Spain and into France and all throughout Italy and along the coast of the Adriatic Sea here in Greece and so forth in 1348. Already at the end of 1348, it was in the British Isles. London was infected in late 1348. From there, it spread into the German lands and into the rest of the British Isles in 1349 and into Scotland in 1350, as well as Scandinavia and places like that. The one place that somehow escaped this, and this is, I find this ironic because Poland has tended not to escape a lot of calamities, right? I think the wars of the modern era and so forth. But the Polish king seems to have, his name was Kazimierz, which is Polish for Charles. He seems to have taken pretty effective quarantine measures and sealed off the borders of his country. And there is little evidence that the plague, or no evidence actually, the plague actually reached Poland. So the one time where, kind of Poland escaped without having something terrible happen to that country. Maybe I'm exaggerating there a little bit, right? But Poland does seem to have done well. Initial responses tended to be confusion, sort of tempered with notions of God's judgment, maybe even, kind of the end of the world sort of thing. We'll look at Gabriele de Mussis in a minute here and try to gauge some of that reaction. There's a big debate over numbers of people who died, percentages. Aberth, who, of course, is your textbook for this course, like John Aberth, seems to come down on the side of estimating higher than perhaps others are wont to do. The generally accepted total is that somewhere between a third and a half of the population of Europe and other regions that were affected by the plague died of this disease. And that alone is horrific to even contemplate, right? But if you look at some sources, they seem to indicate that things are higher. Now, we have to be careful taking medieval sources or any pre-modern sources at their word when it comes to things like numbers, because they tended to exaggerate. They were not keeping careful statistical tallies of the number of people infected and all of that. We've seen during COVID how difficult it was to sort of keep accurate records, right? Because some people, would die in hospitals and it was just assumed that they died of COVID or other things, but maybe they had other, illnesses, and there were so many cases of COVID that, some things that may not have been COVID were chalked up to COVID, or vice versa. Some people may have, were thought to have died of other things who may have had COVID as something that exacerbated an already existing condition or something like that, right? So it's hard even in the modern day to keep accurate records. In the medieval period, this was not a thing that governments did or any organizations did necessarily, at least not carefully, right? And so we rely on these anecdotal accounts where it's like 70% of the population of Genoa died in the plague or whatever. Or scarcely 1 in 10 persons lived at the end of the plague. And maybe that was true in some areas. And so Aberth is a little more accepting, I think, of that, and hints that it might have been more like, he revises the range upward and says 40 to 60% of the population of Europe died, which I think is plausible, right? But not necessarily definitive. We will look in this class at medical explanations. That's going to be in the next lecture, and also to these kind of radical responses. And so I want to save that discussion for the next video. We should also mention that there were lots of reoccurrences, and I guess I already sort of have done that, but every few years is another reoccurrence of plague. In the Horrocks book, and I didn't assign these sources necessarily, but there are lots of sources about, the outbreaks of plague in the 1350s and again in the 1360s and again in the 1370s and even forward into the 15th century. There are repeated outbreaks of plague all the way to about the 17th century. Okay. So I want to just take a couple of minutes and look at, and more to gauge kind of the initial response to this. This is one of the fullest sources we have that describes the plague. It's an Italian named Gabriele de Mussis, who, as it says here, was a lawyer in Piacenza, which was close to Genoa, right? Or he had knowledge of the way that the plague spread to Genoa, which was one of the largest cities in Europe at the time and one of the most economically vibrant cities. And what is, as is typical, he explains this by the whole human race was wallowing in manifold wickedness, right? That this was a punishment from God because of our sins. That is a common theme that you see repeated over and over and over again in the sources, right? That this is their most ready way they have of explaining why this very confusing and frightening, even terrifying thing is happening to them. It must be that God is angry with us. Understandable, I suppose, in the circumstances. And he even sort of puts words into the voice of God here, right? Let hunger strike down. And notice that he's not just referring to the plague. He's talking about all these other calamities too. Hunger. And so maybe that's a reference to the Great Famine or the famines that had pervaded in Europe. Let dissensions arise, let kingdoms be consumed in detestable war. So he's conscious of war. And then, and so, the famine and the war work together with plague to bring human misery and horrific numbers of dead, right? That's really the theme of this entire course. Well, this is a statement here that encapsulates all of that, right? The scientific explanation, and we'll look at other sources that detail this, is that the air was corrupted because there was a relationship in the medieval understanding of things between what happened in the heavens with all of the planets and the stars and all of that, and what happened on Earth. And I will explain this in more detail, but he basically says, let the planets poison the air and corrupt the whole Earth. He's, again, speaking as God here. This is how it was understood. The planets were in a wrong alignment, a wrong conjunction, and that drew up poisonous vapors from the earth, and this is what was causing the disease, right? It has to be some corruption of the air or the water or something like that. So, of course, they did not have microscopes to look at germs. They didn't even conceive of those sorts of things. This was the medical explanation for the time, and I think it's easy for us in the modern day to say, oh, how quaint that is, right? But this was plausible, and it was actually very well explained. That doesn't mean it's accurate, but this was believed, and people understood things this way. And so it's important to sort of comprehend that, right? He explains, and here's a reference to the Avignon papacy again, right? That the priests and the clergy were not doing what they should. They themselves were wicked, and this is one of the things that precipitated God's judgments being brought down upon them. He discusses the trade routes, and being from a place like Piacenza and, kind of northern Italy generally, which is this very economically vibrant place, he would have been conscious of the trade routes, right? He talks about Genoese living in Kaffa, which is along the Black Sea, I believe, and coming into contact with these people he calls Tartars. These are probably Mongols, almost certainly Mongols. And that they besieged Kaffa. The Genoese took refuge in that city. And then the Tartars themselves, the Mongols, were hit by the plague, but to make sure their enemies didn't escape from them, they flung the rotting corpses into the city via catapults, and this made everybody else sick. And then these Genoese, who finally escaped the siege of Kaffa, took ships back to Genoa, and they came in and, because their families were so worried about them, they went to greet them in the harbor, and everybody had these reunions where they hugged and kissed each other, and this is, of course, what spread the plague. And within 3 days, the family was afflicted with this and started to die, right? So this spread very quickly. And here he says scarcely 1 in 7 of the Genoese survived. In Venice, 70% of the people died, right? These are these extremely high estimates. And so many people died that they couldn't bury them properly. They had to dig mass graves in places where they hadn't dreamed of burying bodies before, even in like public squares, and just dump some dirt over them, right? And so the common feeling that occurs with death and funerals and all of that kind of went away, and people were just too afraid to even memorialize their dead. So this affected the culture of the funerary culture, as it were, okay? When one person lay sick in a house, no one would come near. Even dear friends would hide themselves away. The physician would not visit. The priest, panic stricken, administered the sacraments with fear and trembling. So the priest runs in, administers last rites, and gets out before he gets sick. This seems to have been a common sight. And he just sort of encapsulates this with this very emotional appeal. What a tragic and wretched sight. Who would not shed sympathetic tears? Who would not be shaken by the disastrous plague and the terrors of death, right? And so there's more to this. He talks about the symptoms of the disease here a little bit, which we've already kind of covered, right? So you can take a source like this and glean a great deal of information from it. And I've assigned you a lot of sources that are very rich in information about the Black Death in the Horrocks book. And I would encourage you to really dig in, read these closely, start thinking about the issues that people were confronting at this time. All right, thanks.